Nothing about this move was dramatic. No emergency meetings, no breaking alerts, no visible shockwaves across global markets. And that is precisely why it matters. When Japan reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasuries by nearly $50 billion in a compressed window, it did not announce a decision. It executed a protocol. The numbers appeared later, buried inside routine reporting, stripped of narrative, stripped of urgency. To most observers, it looked like maintenance, a technical adjustment, a footnote in a data table. But financial systems do not move like headlines. They move like architecture. Load is redistributed. Weight is shifted. Stress migrates quietly from one support column to another. And when the structure eventually fails, it does not collapse where the cameras are pointing. It collapses where the pressure has been accumulating for years. The assumption most people carry is simple. U.S. Treasuries are the safest asset in the world. Japan is America's closest ally in Asia. Therefore, Japan selling treasuries cannot mean anything structural. That assumption is no longer reliable. This event does not matter because of its size. $50 billion is not large enough to break the market. It matters because of its timing, its velocity, and its direction. It matters because Japan did not rotate gradually. It did not signal discomfort through rhetoric. It acted through balance sheets. And balance sheets do not lie. They encode intent. In public discourse, attention is drawn to elections, conflicts, summits, and statements. These are the visible layers of the system. They are necessary theater. They create the illusion of control. But beneath that layer, another system operates with colder logic: capital flows, reserve composition, settlement risk, currency defense. That system does not debate. It does not persuade. It reallocates. Japan's treasury sale was not a protest. It was not a threat. It was not a rebuke of U.S. policy. Those interpretations belong to the surface world. This was an act of pressure management. And pressure, once released in one place, always concentrates somewhere else. The critical mistake is to treat this as a historical footnote rather than a present signal. The relevance is not tied to past cycles or precedent. It is tied to the current configuration of the global system: high interest rates, concentrated debt issuance, currency misalignment, and declining tolerance for duration risk. What matters now is not trust. It is liquidity under strain. Japan sits at the intersection of two gravitational forces: a weakening domestic currency and a strengthening U.S. dollar. Holding treasuries in that environment is not neutral. It is costly. It is destabilizing. And at a certain threshold, it becomes strategically irrational. The sale, therefore, was not about exiting the dollar. It was about defending the yen. But that explanation, while accurate, is incomplete. Currency defense explains the action. It does not explain the implications. Because when the largest foreign holder of U.S. government debt is forced to liquidate reserves to stabilize its own system, the assumption of infinite external demand begins to erode. Quietly, incrementally, without panic. This is not a story about collapse. It is a story about constraint. All major actors in this system are constrained by demographics, by debt loads, by political commitments, by prior promises. Japan is not acting freely. Neither is the United States. Neither are the institutions that sit between them. And when constrained actors move capital, they reveal where the stress actually is. The purpose of this investigation is not to predict crisis or assign blame. It is to examine the structural meaning of this transaction, to treat it not as a trade, but as a message encoded in financial infrastructure. Because the most important developments in global power shifts are no longer announced. They are settled. This introduction does not ask whether Japan's move was justified. That question belongs to commentary. Instead, it asks something more dangerous. What does it mean when the system's most reliable participants begin adjusting for a future they are not describing? The data does not shout. It accumulates. And when read carefully, it tells a story more disturbing than any headline. The reduction in Japan's U.S. Treasury holdings occurred within a narrow reporting window. The speed matters. Gradual portfolio rebalancing looks different in the data. This did not unfold over quarters. It compressed into weeks. Japan's total holdings remain large, but that framing obscures the signal. Large systems do not pivot all at once. They test load-bearing limits. They shed weight where stress is highest. The sales coincided with intensified yen weakness and increased market speculation about direct currency intervention. The correlation is not incidental. It reflects a funding decision. Dollars were needed immediately. This was not yield optimization. It was liquidity extraction. Under normal conditions, treasuries serve as reserve ballast. They are not sold quickly unless something else is failing. The abnormality lies not in the sale itself, but in the necessity of it. Japan traditionally manages currency pressure through signaling and incremental action. Liquidating treasuries is a blunt instrument. It introduces volatility. It incurs losses. It draws attention, even when executed quietly. That Japan chose this method indicates that softer tools were insufficient. Strategically, this move signals a shift from optimization to defense. When systems enter defensive posture, their priority narrows. Optionality decreases. Japan is not preparing for expansion. It is absorbing shock. This reframes the narrative. Allies are not aligning out of confidence. They are repositioning out of necessity. Every sale creates a buyer. The question is not who purchased these treasuries, but at what price and under what conditions. Increased issuance from the U.S. Treasury collides with reduced foreign tolerance for duration. The pressure migrates inward, toward domestic buyers, toward central bank balance sheets, toward financial intermediaries already exposed to rate risk. Pressure does not disappear. It concentrates. The proceeds of the sale did not circulate freely. They were deployed defensively into currency markets, into stabilization efforts, into short-term positioning. This is not capital seeking opportunity. It is capital sealing fractures. The United States benefits from global demand for its debt until that demand becomes conditional. Conditional demand is not stable demand. It is transactional, price-sensitive, and reversible. Japan's move strengthens its immediate position while subtly weakening the long-term assumption that treasuries are held regardless of cost. This is not a break. It is a shift in tolerance. And shifts in tolerance precede structural change. This moment cannot be understood through the language of cycles. Cycles imply repetition. Repetition implies recovery. What is unfolding now belongs to a different category, one defined not by oscillation, but by compression. The system is no longer expanding outward. It is tightening inward, redistributing strain across structures that were designed for a very different era. That is what makes this moment fundamentally different. In past periods of stress, capital fled risk and concentrated into safe havens that were genuinely capable of absorbing it. The architecture was lighter. The demographic base was broader. Debt growth was linear rather than exponential. There was room for error, and more importantly, room for delay. That margin no longer exists. What has quietly shifted beneath the visible system is not confidence, but capacity. The ability of institutions to carry weight without deformation has diminished. The load, however, has not. It has increased steadily, predictably, and with remarkable consistency. This is the contradiction now embedded in the global structure. More debt, less tolerance. More issuance, fewer unquestioned buyers. More intervention, less maneuvering room. Safety, in this environment, is no longer a location. It is a condition temporary, contingent, and revocable. U.S. Treasuries were never safe because they were perfect. They were safe because they were liquid, deep, and universally accepted as neutral ballast. They were the foundation slab of the system. Unremarkable, heavy, and assumed to hold. But foundations fail differently than towers. They do not fall. They settle, and settlement is almost invisible until the cracks reach the surface. Japan's action belongs to this phase. It does not announce abandonment. It reflects recalibration, a recognition that holding weight indefinitely now carries cost, volatility, and political consequence. That recognition did not originate in ideology or alliance politics. It originated in arithmetic. Arithmetic is unforgiving. When currency defense requires asset liquidation, the meaning of reserves changes. They cease to be inert storage and become active instruments of stress absorption. At that point, reserves are no longer symbols of strength. They are tools under strain. This is how systems begin to fail quietly, not through rupture, but through role reversal. Assets once meant to stabilize others are consumed to stabilize the self. The shift is subtle but decisive. Traditional safe havens rely on one assumption above all others, though when stress rises, demand becomes unconditional. Price becomes secondary to security. Duration becomes irrelevant. Losses are tolerated in exchange for stability. That assumption is now conditional. Duration risk matters again. Currency alignment matters again. Political exposure matters again. And when those conditions re-enter the equation, safety fragments. What we are witnessing is not a rejection of a system, but a recognition of its limits. Insiders are not fleeing because collapse is imminent. They are repositioning because friction has returned to a structure once defined by smooth flow. This is how exits actually begin, not with panic, but with optimization under constraint. The most revealing signals are not speeches or policy documents. They are behavioral deviations, actions that technically fit within existing frameworks, yet violate long-standing norms of comfort. Large, quiet sales, shortened duration preferences, increased reliance on intervention rather than patience, reduced tolerance for paper losses once considered acceptable. These behaviors indicate that actors no longer trust time to resolve imbalance. Time itself has become expensive. Current stability, therefore, is not organic. It is manufactured, maintained through constant pressure management, continuous signaling, and synchronized restraint. That does not invalidate it, but it does define it as conditional. Engineered systems hold until they don't. And when they don't, they do not warn. The critical shift underway is not geopolitical alignment or economic ideology. It is procedural. The system is moving from assumption-based operation to protocol-based survival. Protocol replaces trust. Liquidity replaces loyalty. Flexibility replaces permanence. This is not a future scenario. It is already observable in how balance sheets are treated, how reserves are mobilized, and how risk is priced, quietly, cautiously, and incrementally. The next phase will not be marked by a single event. It will be confirmed through repetition. More actors acting defensively, more weight shifting inward, more tolerance thresholds breached without announcement. Watch for sustained patterns, not dramatic moments. Watch for velocity, not volume. Watch for what is sold reluctantly, not what is praised publicly. Because systems do not declare when they're no longer stable. They reveal it by how often they must intervene to remain so. This is not collapse language. It is structural language. What comes next will feel slow until it feels sudden. Not because change accelerates, but because recognition lags. By the time consensus forms, the architecture will already have adjusted. And when historians eventually trace the origin of the shift, they will not point to a crisis headline or a televised confrontation. They will point to quiet reallocations, buried data releases, and transactions that looked routine to those not trained to read them. Moments like this are not warnings. They are records, the kind that only make sense later, when a structure has already moved and the old assumptions no longer fit. Some changes do not announce themselves. They simply make themselves unavoidable.